The 40-Year Silence. The murder of Sylvia Quayle. A killer hid in plain sight for more than 40 years. He got married. He worked. He paid bills. He blended into everyday life. And all the while, investigators possessed evidence that linked him to a brutal murder. The evidence existed. The truth existed. But the technology needed to expose that truth had not yet been invented. For 4 decades, a family waited for answers. For 4 decades, detectives revisited old files, hoping to discover something they had missed. And for 4 decades, a murderer believed he had escaped justice forever. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to D-Shadow Report, and comment below. Do you believe there is such a thing as the perfect crime? Because this case suggests something chilling. Sometimes a crime is not perfect. It is simply ahead of its time. And when technology finally catches up, the truth can come crashing back decades later. This is the story of Sylvia Quayle. A story of violence. A story of perseverance. And a story that proves the past is never as far away as it seems. The year was 1981. America was changing. The Cold War dominated headlines. Personal computers were still a novelty. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Investigators relied heavily on witness statements, fingerprints, physical evidence, and instinct. If a criminal avoided leaving obvious clues, solving a case became dramatically more difficult. In many ways, detectives were fighting crime with tools that today would seem primitive, and yet they were expected to solve impossible mysteries. One of those mysteries would emerge from a quiet Colorado community known as Cherry Hills Village, an affluent suburb south of Denver. A place known for large homes, tree-lined streets, and an overwhelming sense of security. Residents believed they lived in one of the safest places in the state. Violent crime was rare. Murder was almost unthinkable. But on August 4th, 1981, that illusion would shatter. Because behind the walls of one home, a horrific crime had occurred. A crime that would remain unsolved for more than 40 years. To understand why this case shocked so many people, it's important to understand the community where it happened. Cherry Hills Village was not the kind of place typically associated with violent crime. The area was known for its quiet atmosphere. Children played outside. Neighbors trusted one another. Many residents had lived there for years. The community projected stability, predictability, safety. When crimes occurred, they were usually minor. Nothing that would attract national attention. Nothing that would dominate headlines. That sense of security created an environment where people rarely expected danger. And perhaps that made what happened even more disturbing. Because sometimes the most terrifying crimes occur in places where nobody expects them. Places where people feel protected. Places where residents assume they know their neighbors. Places exactly like Cherry Hills Village. Before Sylvia Quayle became the center of a cold case investigation, she was simply a daughter, a family member, a friend, a human being with routines, responsibilities, and plans for the future. People who knew Sylvia described her as dependable. She maintained close relationships with her family. She lived near her parents. Their homes were separated by only a short distance. That proximity helped create a daily tradition. Each morning, Sylvia would meet her parents for coffee. It was a simple routine, but routines often become the foundation of our lives. And because they occur so frequently, we rarely imagine they could suddenly disappear. For Sylvia's family, these daily visits were ordinary, expected, comforting. No one could have imagined that one missed coffee appointment would become the first sign of tragedy. As investigators would later discover, Sylvia's life showed no obvious indication that she was in immediate danger. There were no public warnings, no clear signs of impending violence, nothing that suggested her name would soon become associated with one of Colorado's most enduring cold cases.
One of the most haunting aspects of many murder investigations is how ordinary the final hours often appear. Victims complete routine tasks, they make plans, they interact with family and friends. Nothing seems unusual, nothing feels significant. Only afterward do investigators revisit those moments, searching for clues hidden within ordinary life. For Sylvia Quayle, the final known period before her death appears remarkably normal. The neighborhood remained peaceful. Residents continued their daily activities. No one reported witnessing a dramatic confrontation. No one realized that investigators would eventually scrutinize nearly every detail connected to the case. And somewhere during those hours, a series of events unfolded that ended in violence. Events that would remain hidden for decades. Events known only to Sylvia and the person responsible. For detectives, reconstructing those final hours became one of the most important challenges in the investigation, because understanding what happened before the crime could reveal who committed it. But as the years passed, answers remained frustratingly out of reach. August 4th began like any other summer morning. The sun rose over Cherry Hills Village. Residents prepared for work. The community followed its usual rhythm, and Sylvia was expected to meet her parents. But this time, she never arrived. At first, the delay seemed insignificant. People run late. Plans change. Unexpected interruptions happen. There was no immediate reason to assume something terrible had occurred. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Concern slowly replaced patience. For Sylvia's parents, the absence felt unusual. This wasn't typical behavior. Something seemed wrong. The feeling was difficult to explain, yet impossible to ignore. Eventually, Sylvia's father decided to check on her. His destination was only a short walk away, approximately 150 feet, a journey measured in seconds, a journey he had likely made countless times before. What he didn't know was that this particular walk would become one of the most devastating moments of his life. Imagine that moment, the quiet neighborhood, the familiar route, the expectation that everything would be normal. There was no reason to suspect otherwise, no visible signs of danger, no indication that tragedy waited ahead. As Sylvia's father approached the home, the world around him appeared unchanged. The neighborhood remained calm. The morning remained peaceful. But appearances can be deceptive. And sometimes the most horrifying realities hide behind ordinary doors. He reached the house. He entered. And within moments, his life would be divided into two chapters. Everything before what he was about to see, and everything after. What he discovered inside would launch a murder investigation that would span generations. An investigation that would challenge detectives, frustrate families, and eventually test the limits of forensic science. But before investigators could search for a killer, they first had to understand the crime scene itself. And what detectives encountered that morning would leave no doubt about one thing. This was no accident. This was murder. As police units raced toward the scene, no one yet understood that they were stepping into a mystery that would remain unsolved for more than 40 years. A mystery whose solution was already present at the crime scene. A mystery that would wait decades for science to reveal its secrets. The moment Sylvia's father entered the house, everything changed. Only moments earlier, he had been performing a routine check, a simple walk, a quick visit, the kind of thing parents do without a second thought. But now, he was standing inside a scene that would haunt his family for the rest of their lives. The details were devastating. His daughter was dead. The peaceful routine that had defined so many mornings had ended in unimaginable violence. For any parent, discovering a child under such circumstances is a nightmare beyond words. And for investigators arriving at the scene, it was immediately clear that this was not a natural death. This was a homicide. The quiet neighborhood of Cherry Hills Village had just become the setting of one of Colorado's most enduring murder mysteries. Police officers secured the property. Detectives were called. Crime scene technicians began documenting every detail. At that moment, nobody could have known they were collecting evidence that would eventually solve the case more than 4 decades later. The home quickly became the focus of an intensive investigation. Every room was examined. Every possible clue was documented. Investigators understood that the first hours of a homicide investigation are often the most critical. Mistakes made at the beginning can affect a case for years. In 1981, forensic science was far more limited than it is today. Crime scene investigators could collect evidence. They could preserve biological material. They could analyze fingerprints. But they could not yet perform the sophisticated DNA comparisons that modern investigators rely upon. Still, detectives worked methodically. Photographs were taken. Physical evidence was preserved. Detailed notes were recorded. The scene suggested a violent confrontation. The attack had been personal, brutal, and deeply disturbing. According to later reporting and court records, Sylvia had suffered multiple forms of violence during the attack. The severity of the crime left investigators determined to identify whoever was responsible. But determination alone would not be enough, because the person who committed this crime had left behind very few immediate answers. As detectives began piecing together the circumstances surrounding Sylvia's death, several critical questions emerged. Who had access to the house? Who had seen Sylvia recently? Was the attacker someone she knew? Or had a stranger entered her home? These questions would guide the investigation for years. The challenge was that every answer seemed to create new uncertainties. Neighbors were interviewed. Friends were questioned. Family members were asked to reconstruct Sylvia's recent activities. Investigators searched for anything unusual, any argument, any threat, any suspicious encounter, anything that might explain why someone would target her. But the more detectives looked, the more puzzling the case became. There was no obvious suspect standing out from the crowd. No immediate breakthrough. No dramatic confession. Just a growing list of unanswered questions. News of the murder spread quickly through Cherry Hills Village. Residents struggled to comprehend what had happened. Violent crime was not something people expected to encounter in their neighborhood. The idea that a woman could be murdered inside her own home shook the community's sense of security. People began locking doors that had rarely been locked before. Conversations turned towards safety. Neighbors wondered whether a dangerous person might still be nearby. Fear began replacing certainty. For many residents, the crime felt deeply personal. If something like this could happen to Sylvia Quayle, what did that mean for everyone else? The murder was no longer just an investigation. It was a wound within the community. And as weeks turned into months, that wound showed little sign of healing, because the killer remained unidentified. Investigators continued analyzing the evidence collected from the scene. Among the most important pieces of evidence was biological material preserved by crime scene technicians. At the time, its full significance was impossible to appreciate. The evidence was carefully stored, cataloged, protected, waiting. Years later, advances in forensic science would reveal just how valuable that evidence truly was. But in 1981, detectives could only work with the tools available, and those tools had limitations. Evidence that would one day identify a killer could not yet speak clearly enough. The clues existed. The science did not. This would become one of the defining frustrations of the case. Investigators knew the answer was probably hidden somewhere within the evidence. They simply lacked the technology to unlock it. As the investigation intensified, detectives expanded their search. People connected to Sylvia's life were examined. Potential suspects were evaluated. Tips were reviewed. Leads were followed. But none produced the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. Each possibility seemed promising at first, then collapsed under scrutiny. The absence of a clear suspect created growing frustration. Months passed, then years, and still no arrest. The murder remained unsolved. For Sylvia's family, every passing day deepened the pain. The crime itself had taken one thing from them. The lack of answers was taking something else: hope. Yet despite the setbacks, investigators refused to completely abandon the case. The evidence remained. And as long as the evidence remained, so did the possibility of justice. Cold cases rarely become cold overnight. The process happens gradually. The initial urgency fades. Witnesses move away. Memories weaken. Leads disappear. Investigators are reassigned. New cases demand attention. Slowly, momentum begins to vanish. That is exactly what happened here. The Sylvia Quayle investigation continued. Files remained active. Periodic reviews occurred. But the dramatic breakthrough everyone hoped for never arrived. The case entered a difficult stage, a stage familiar to many families of homicide victims. Waiting. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for news. Waiting for answers. And often wondering whether those answers would ever come. What nobody realized was that the future of the case would depend on scientific advancements that had not yet been invented. As the years passed, the investigation drifted further from the public spotlight. But behind the scenes, detectives never completely gave up. The evidence remained preserved. The questions remained unanswered. And somewhere beyond the reach of investigators, the person responsible continued living life as though nothing had happened. As the 1980s moved forward, the Sylvia Quayle investigation slowly slipped out of the public spotlight. There was no dramatic closure,
No arrest, no courtroom resolution. Just a case file, growing thicker with time. In the beginning, detectives still revisited it regularly. They reviewed evidence, checked old leads, followed up on tips. But each passing year made the investigation more difficult. Witnesses moved away, memories faded, new cases demanded attention. And gradually, the urgency that once surrounded Sylvia's murder began to dissolve. But the evidence never disappeared. It remained carefully preserved, waiting for a future that no one yet understood. For Sylvia's family, the passage of time did not bring peace. It brought something far more difficult to live with: uncertainty. There were no answers to accept, no final explanation, no sense of justice served. Just silence. And silence can be its own kind of suffering. Every anniversary of her death reopened old wounds. Every news report about similar cases brought back painful memories. And every passing year raised the same haunting question: who did this, and why? Without answers, the imagination fills the gaps, and those gaps can become unbearable. Over the years, investigators pursued numerous leads. Some came from tips, others from individuals claiming to know something about the crime, and a few from people attempting to confess to crimes they did not commit. One of the most notable moments in the investigation involved a confession from a serial offender whose claims initially drew attention from law enforcement. For a brief time, it appeared that a breakthrough might finally be within reach. But as investigators examined the details, inconsistencies began to emerge. The timeline did not align. The physical evidence did not match. And ultimately, the confession could not be substantiated. It was ruled out. Another dead end in a growing list of possibilities. Each false lead carried emotional weight, not just for investigators, but for Sylvia's family. Because every time a new possibility emerged, hope briefly returned. And every time it collapsed, that hope was taken away again. Cold cases create a unique kind of pressure on detectives. There is no immediate urgency, no active suspect to pursue, no ongoing crime to stop. Only the responsibility of trying to solve something that already happened long ago. Over time, resources shift, personnel change, departments evolve, and investigations rely increasingly on archived evidence rather than fresh leads. The Sylvia Quayle case became one of those files. Still open, still important, but increasingly quiet. Behind the scenes, however, something important was happening. A scientific revolution was beginning, and investigators did not yet realize it would change everything. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science was undergoing a transformation. DNA profiling had become a powerful investigative tool. Crimes that once seemed unsolvable were now being reopened. Cold cases across the country began to yield answers. But even with this advancement, not every case could be solved immediately. It depended on the quality of preserved evidence and whether it could be entered into national databases. In Sylvia Quayle's case, investigators had preserved biological evidence from the original crime scene. That evidence now held new potential. But there was still a problem. A match had to exist in the system. And for years, there was none. The killer remained unidentified in the database, which meant the case stayed cold. As DNA technology improved further, a new possibility began to emerge: genetic genealogy, a method that could identify suspects through distant family connections rather than direct matches. This approach would eventually become the key to solving numerous cold cases nationwide. But at the time, it was still developing, and Sylvia Quayle's case remained locked in the past. Investigators held on to hope because they knew something important. They had preserved the evidence, and preserved evidence never loses its value. It only waits for the right moment. For more than 4 decades, the case remained unsolved. A name without a suspect. A crime without closure. A family without answers. But while the investigation appeared frozen in time, science was preparing to restart it. For more than 40 years, Sylvia Quayle's case remained unchanged. A file in storage, a preserved set of evidence, and a question that refused to disappear. But behind the scenes, something important was happening. Cold case investigators were quietly returning to old evidence using modern forensic technology. This time, they were not limited to traditional DNA comparison. They were using tools that did not exist in 1981. One of those tools would change everything: genetic genealogy, a method capable of identifying suspects through distant family connections. And for the first time in decades, Sylvia's case had a real chance of breaking open. Investigators carefully re-examined the biological evidence collected from the crime scene. What once had been stored as simply evidence now became a critical key. Advanced DNA profiling was applied. The result was not a direct match, but it was something just as powerful: a partial genetic profile. Enough to begin a genealogical search. Specialists began tracing family connections through public and private DNA databases. Step by step, branch by branch, generation by generation, a pattern began to form. And slowly, a potential family line emerged. From that line, investigators identified a man who matched the expected profile. A man who had lived for decades without drawing attention. A man who had never appeared in connection with the case. Until now. His name was David Dwayne Anderson. Once a potential suspect was identified, investigators did not move immediately. They worked carefully, quietly, methodically. They needed confirmation, not assumptions. Surveillance began. Additional DNA was obtained through discarded personal items. One of those items, a simple discarded beverage container, would later play a critical role in confirming the match. That sample was compared to the crime scene DNA. The results confirmed what investigators had suspected. There was a direct link. After more than 40 years, science had finally connected the dots. The investigation that had once stalled in the 1980s was suddenly active again. And this time, it had a name. With confirmation in place, authorities moved forward. David Dwayne Anderson was arrested in connection with the 1981 murder of Sylvia Quayle. The news marked a turning point in one of Colorado's longest-running cold cases. A case that had once seemed permanently unsolvable was now before the justice system. For investigators, it represented the power of persistence. For forensic scientists, it represented the evolution of technology. But for Sylvia's family, it meant something far more personal. After 40 years of waiting, they finally had an answer. As the case moved through the legal system, the decades-long investigation finally entered the courtroom. Evidence that had been preserved since 1981 was now presented with modern scientific clarity. DNA results, forensic analysis, chain of custody documentation. Everything pointed back to a single conclusion. The suspect had been identified through science that did not exist at the time of the crime. In 2022, following trial proceedings, David Dwayne Anderson was convicted for the murder of Sylvia Quayle. The verdict brought official closure to one of Colorado's most enduring cold cases.
For Sylvia's family, the conviction did not erase the past. It could not bring her back. It could not undo the pain. But it did something that had been missing for decades. It gave them truth. It confirmed that the investigation had not been forgotten, and that Sylvia's life mattered enough for justice to eventually arrive, no matter how long it took. After 40 years of silence, the case finally had an ending.
Sylvia Quayle's story is more than a murder investigation. It is a reminder that time does not erase evidence. It only delays understanding. What was once impossible to solve became solvable. And what was once lost in silence was finally brought into the light. But perhaps the most haunting question remains: how many other cases are still waiting for science to catch up?
If this story impacted you, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to D Shadow Report for more true crime documentaries. And tell us in the comments, do you believe there are still cold cases out there waiting for breakthroughs like this? Or are some mysteries destined to remain unsolved forever? Thank you for watching. And remember, some truths are not lost. They are just waiting to be discovered.